Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material.
And I have to say, it is a phenomenal stack of material to unpack today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we are looking at this system of power that is, entirely invisible to the naked eye.
Yeah.
But it completely dictates the geopolitical reality of the world's most populous region.
Right. So we are pulling apart Edward H. Whitmore's 2026 work, Covert Operations Series India, Regional Power, Intelligence Wars, and the Hidden Operations Shaping South Asia.
It's quite a title.
It is, yeah. And what's really striking right out of the gate here is how it just completely dismantles the conventional diplomatic lens we're also used to.
I mean, totally. If you are accustomed to, analyzing South Asian power through official state visits or trade agreements.
Or conventional troop deployments, right.
Exactly. This analysis forces a hard reset on all of that. Whitmore's central premise is that the overt, visible statecraft is largely just theater.
Like a facade, almost.
Yeah, the actual architecture of power, the real crucible where national survival is negotiated, is this brutal, silent, and just unending shadow war.
And that shadow war, it isn't just some secondary characteristic of the state, right? It's the primary engine.
Right, of its entire foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. Because we are examining a nation that is constantly in the state of high-stakes, multi-directional friction.
Yeah, and the intelligence apparatus there, it's not just a support structure gathering data for policymakers in a nice office.
No, it's an active, kinetic lifeline. I mean, I really want you, the listener, to try and map out the sheer cognitive and operational burden of this reality.
Oh, it's staggering.
Right. Imagine trying to secure a continent-sized democracy where almost every single border represents an active, lethal fault line.
With nuclear-armed neighbors, no less.
Exactly. And highly permeable borders. So these intelligence agencies, they are the actual vanguards of national security. They're fighting daily attritional warfare that, never makes the evening news.
Which means the intelligence doctrine itself has been forced into this really aggressive posture. Whitmore calls it anticipatory defense.
Anticipatory defense. And to really grasp what that means, we have to unpack this dual-front reality they live in, right?
Yeah, because this isn't some theoretical two-front war. It's a permanent, daily, operational environment.
So let's start with the Western Front.
Right. So on the Western Front, India faces Pakistan, and specifically its intelligence organ, the ISI. The Inter-Services Intelligence.
And Whitmore describes this as a very visceral, deeply entrenched conflict.
Well, highly proxy-heavy. It's very human intelligence-driven, very kinetic, and just incredibly grueling.
Let's break down the mechanics of that a bit, because it's essentially a decades-long war of attrition.
It really is.
You have these infiltration networks operating through the mountains in Kashmir, which are, some of the most hostile, geographically punishing mountain ranges on Earth.
Yeah, you can't just hold that front with some satellite imagery.
Right, it's boots on the ground. You have to rely on this vast, super fragile network of compromised informants.
You're tracking the movement of illicit funding through these informal Hawala networks.
Triangulating low-bandwidth radio bursts from militant handlers.
Exactly. The margin between a secured border and a devastating urban terror attack, it's dictated by incredibly localized physical intelligence gathering.
But then, if you pivot to the Eastern and Northern Front against China, the operational requirements completely invert.
Like day and night. Here, India is facing the Ministry of State Security, the MSS, and the People's Liberation Army.
So no longer a low-tech proxy insurgency?
No, this is high-altitude, state-backed, technologically supreme hybrid war.
Right. The Chinese doctrine heavily utilizes what analysts call salami slicing in the Himalayas.
Salami slicing, yeah. Which is essentially these incremental microaggressions.
Like building up tiny bits of infrastructure.
Right, just altering the territorial status quo so subtly that it kind of defies any conventional military response.
Which means the intelligence you need to counter it has to be entirely different.
Completely. Dealing with China requires tracking massive, state-funded logistical supply chains.
Defending against sophisticated electronic espionage.
Anticipating coordinated cyber intrusions. It's a very cold, algorithmic, surveillance-heavy theater.
A total contrast to the visceral proxy war on the western border.
Exactly. And then you have to add another layer of complexity to that, which is the internal crucible.
Oh, right. the domestic side.
Yeah, because you have this vast, incredibly diverse domestic landscape with historical communal fissures, regional insurgencies.
Urban radicalization vulnerabilities.
Right. And foreign intelligence services, particularly the ISI, they view these domestic fault lines as weaponizable assets.
So they're actively cultivating sleeper cells.
Cultivating cells, exploiting local grievances, funneling logistics to domestic radical networks.
So domestic policing and international espionage aren't just separate silos. They are inextricably linked battlegrounds.
Which is a nightmare to manage.
It is. I mean, looking at this geopolitical situation, it feels like a high-stakes pressure cooker, but there's absolutely no release valve.
That's a perfect analogy.
And the intelligence agencies, they aren't just standing around the stove watching the dials, right? They're actively having to reach their hands straight into the scalding steam to dismantle the heat source itself.
Well, and I would actually take that analogy a step further.
Oh.
Yeah, they aren't just dismantling the heat source. The evolution of their doctrine shows they are actively redirecting that scalding steam right back at the adversary.
Oh.
That is the core of anticipatory defense. In this specific ecosystem, a reactive posture is fatal.
Because if you're waiting for a threat to materialize within your borders before acting, you've already lost.
Precisely. The mandate is to anticipate, preempt, and disrupt foreign capabilities deep within hostile territory long before they ever approach a border.
But to execute that kind of proactive disruption, you need a very specific institutional machine.
Yes, you do.
And this is where the historical context in the book becomes so vital. To understand the architecture of shadows, the division between RAW and the IB, we have to talk about 1962.
The 1962 Sino-Indian War, the foundational trauma of the modern Indian intelligence apparatus.
What exactly happened there?
Well, prior to that conflict, India relied almost exclusively on the Intelligence Bureau, the IB.
Right.
And the IB was a holdover from colonial administration dating back to 1887. It was culturally and structurally wired for domestic surveillance.
Monitoring dissidents, internal security, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Local counterintelligence. So when the Chinese offensive launched in the Himalayas, New Delhi was utterly blindsided.
Because they had no external eyes.
Right. The political leadership thought they were prepared, but the mechanisms of foreign intelligence were virtually non-existent.
They lacked dedicated signals intelligence to intercept communications.
They had essentially zero validated human intelligence, or human, operating deep inside Tibet.
Wow. So the border patrols were just completely blind.
Totally blind. And the fallout from that failure was a ruthless political reckoning.
I can imagine.
They realized that relying on a domestically focused police organization to anticipate a hostile foreign military superpower was strategic suicide.
So they needed a new agency, one with a completely different DNA.
Right. An organization explicitly designed, funded, and authorized to operate offensively outside the nation's borders.
And that bureaucratic reckoning gives birth to RAW in 1968, the Research and Analysis Wing.
India's external eyes.
And the way RAW is structured is brilliant from an operational autonomy standpoint, is that?
Yeah. Instead of reporting through the sprawling, leaky bureaucracy of the Home Ministry like the IB does.
RAW reports directly to the Prime Minister's office.
Exactly. They were deliberately insulated from standard civilian administrative entanglements.
So they could move fast, recruit foreign assets, and execute covert actions with absolute secrecy.
But, that sets up an inherent structural friction with the Intelligence Bureau.
Because now you have the IB acting as the internal shield.
Right. And their power lies in their immense grassroots network. They blend into local municipalities, coordinate with state police, build localized informant networks.
But because they operate domestically within a massive democracy, they are bound by strict constitutional frameworks.
Right. They have legal discovery, parliamentary oversight, civil rights constraints.
Whereas RAW, operating entirely on foreign soil, exists in this legally ambiguous, high-risk shadow space where domestic constraints just do not apply.
So you have two massive agencies. One is fundamentally wired for aggressive, clandestine foreign disruption.
Valuing absolute secrecy above all else.
Yeah. And the other is wired for domestic stability, requiring actionable evidentiary proof that can hold up in a democratic legal system.
And you can see how this institutional divide creates incredibly dangerous silos, particularly when a threat crosses that threshold from foreign to domestic.
Oh, absolutely. And the 2010 operations detailed in the material provide just a chilling case study of this exact friction.
This was the impending strike in Mumbai, right?
Yeah, a major terror plot involving both an arms smuggling ring on the eastern border and an impending urban strike in Mumbai.
So, what happened between the agencies?
Well, RAW's foreign capabilities were firing on all cylinders. They had successfully penetrated the communication networks of the foreign handlers.
So, they were reading the adversary's mail.
Exactly. Their signals intelligence was tracking the illicit financial flows, the strategic intent of the attack. They knew it was coming.
But the moment the physical operatives and the hardware cross the border into Indian cities, RAW loses visibility.
Because they cannot run domestic surveillance. They need the IB's vast network of local informants to track the safe houses.
But the handover of that intelligence was anything but fluid, according to the book.
It was a mess. RAW was holding highly classified intercepts acquired through incredibly sensitive foreign technical means and deeply embedded human assets.
And if they hand that raw data over to the IB,
And the IB uses it to conduct massive police raids in densely populated urban centers.
there is a very high probability that RAW's foreign sources are going to be exposed during the resulting legal proceedings or media leaks.
Right, so RAW is heavily filtering the intelligence to protect its sources.
While the IB is on the receiving end saying, you're telling us a catastrophic attack is imminent, but you're only giving us redacted, vague summaries.
We can't mobilize thousands of state police officers and raid urban neighborhoods without concrete, actionable evidence.
Because they're a domestic agency, they need legal justification.
Exactly.
But, I have to push back on this administrative paralysis for a second.
Sure.
If the National Security Advisor, the Prime Minister, and the heads of both agencies know that this structural silo literally cost lives or nearly allowed a massive terror cell to detonate in 2010, why is it so difficult to integrate them?
It seems obvious, right?
Yeah, like why not just create a unified database, put the analysts in the same room, and strip away the bureaucratic turf war?
It's a logical question, but it fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism of intelligence cultures.
How so?
It's not a software integration issue. It's a clash of specialized operational DNA.
Oh, I see.
If you force RAW and the IB into a fully integrated structure, you dilute their core competencies.
Because if RAW is forced to adopt domestic evidentiary standards, they lose that ruthless agility required to operate in hostile foreign capitals.
Exactly. And conversely, if the IB adopts RAW's culture of absolute operational secrecy and deniability,
You risk creating an unaccountable secret police force operating outside the constitutional bounds of a democracy.
which is terrifying.
Oh,
So they exist in completely different operational realities. The exact traits that make a RAW operative effective abroad make them a liability at home, and vice versa.
that makes total sense. So did they fix it after 2010?
Well, they did implement joint task forces and multi-agency coordination centers, but institutional paranoia is resilient,
Bridging that divide requires constant calibration of trust.
which is incredibly difficult when the penalty for an intelligence leak is compromised assets, and the penalty for a failure to act is a bombed city.
Wow. Okay, so let's shift our focus to how this doctrine of covert warfare actually manifested on the ground over the years.
Yeah, the evolution of their tactics.
Because you can trace a really clear evolution of risk appetite from the early days of RAW up to the modern hyperkinetic environment.
And the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War is really the perfect starting point for that.
RAW is barely 3 years old at this point, right?
Barely 3 years old, and they execute an operation that fundamentally alters the geography of South Asia.
So what was the play there? East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh, was in a massive rebellion against the military regime in West Pakistan.
Right. And India recognized this generational strategic opportunity to permanently degrade Pakistan's geopolitical leverage by helping split the country in two.
But they couldn't just launch an overt military invasion.
No, that would have invited immediate international sanctions, probably drawn in other global superpowers.
So RAW is tasked with essentially fighting the war before the official war begins.
Exactly. They take on the orchestration of the Mukti Bahini, the Bengali insurgent forces.
And the mechanics of this operation, according to Whitmore, are just astounding.
RAW operatives are slipping across the border at night, establishing deep cover safe houses in this really dense riverine terrain.
They aren't just funneling small arms either. They're providing heavy logistics, establishing encrypted communication lines.
They're bringing in seasoned Indian military veterans to run clandestine guerrilla warfare training camps.
Wow. And the PSYOPs, the psychological operations, were equally massive.
Oh, huge. RAW established covert radio stations broadcasting directly into East Pakistan, disseminating this carefully crafted propaganda to erode the morale of the Pakistani military.
While emboldening the local populace, they also flooded the zone with counterfeit currency to destabilize the local economy.
And they actively planted highly sophisticated disinformation regarding Indian troop movements.
Which was designed specifically to blind the Pakistani ISI and counterintelligence?
Right. They had the Pakistani military chasing ghosts, misallocating their resources, fortifying the entirely wrong sectors.
Furthermore, RAW provided the Mukti Bahini insurgents with exact, real-time intelligence on Pakistani supply depots and communication nodes.
Allowing the guerrillas to execute these just devastating tactical strikes.
So intelligence was utilized as the ultimate force multiplier here.
Completely. By the time the Indian conventional military officially crossed the border in December of 1971, the Pakistani military infrastructure in the east had already been hollowed out from the inside.
Their logistics were crippled, morale broken, counterintelligence compromised.
RAW proved that an aggressively executed covert campaign could secure a strategic geopolitical victory while maintaining deniability leading up to the kinetic conflict.
Which sets a very aggressive precedent. But if we jump forward to the period between 1993 and 2005, the nature of this shadow war shifts quite a bit.
Yeah, it moves away from orchestrating massive insurgencies toward a brutal micro-level war of attrition.
Specifically focused on the Kashmir Valley. The 1993 infiltration case detailed in the analysis perfectly illustrates this excruciating reality of modern counterintelligence.
It really does. It highlights the asymmetrical advantage of the infiltrator.
Right, because you have highly trained operatives crossing the line of control, equipped with flawlessly forged domestic documentation.
Embedding themselves right into the civilian fabric of local bazaars and municipalities. They are completely disconnected from easily trackable digital networks.
So catching a deep cover infiltrator in this environment, it isn't about satellite surveillance. It requires granular, painstaking human intelligence.
It requires the IB to map out the entire social ecosystem of a neighborhood.
Monitoring minute anomalies in behavior, like a sudden influx of cash at a local business, or a subtle shift in the movement patterns of a known sympathizer.
And they're utilizing local informants who are operating under immense duress, constantly at risk of being executed by the militant cells.
And when they finally do intercept an encrypted radio burst, it's not a clear conversation, right?
No, it's just a fleeting metadata ping.
So they have to triangulate that signal, cross-reference it with the physical surveillance gathered by ground assets, and attempt to isolate the target.
It's grueling.
Okay.
But the counter-strategy Whitmore outlines here is fascinating. Instead of merely arresting the infiltrators, the IB began aggressively turning them.
Oh, right. Capturing key logistical nodes, breaking them through interrogation, and inserting them back into the network as double agents.
They essentially turned the adversary's network against itself.
Wow. But it's an incredibly slow process of systemic sabotage.
Very slow.
Which is why, by 2005, we see a massive shift in India's risk calculus.
Right, moving from passive defense into active, highly provocative offensive action.
The Lahore relay sabotage.
Yes, this is a critical inflection point in the timeline.
So what happens here?
In 2005, RAW operative successfully penetrated deep into Pakistani sovereign territory to execute a physical and electronic sabotage of a primary military communication relay.
So this was not about gathering intelligence.
Not at all. This is a deliberate, destructive kinetic act.
What's the mechanism behind that decision, though? Why take the immense risk of sending operatives into hostile territory, knowing that if they're caught, it could spark a massive diplomatic or even military crisis?
It was a calculated alteration of the deterrence matrix.
Okay, meaning what?
Meaning India was bleeding from continuous proxy-driven terror attacks that the ISI could just plausibly deny.
Right.
So the Lahore sabotage was an unambiguous psychological message sent directly into the adversary's command structure.
It demonstrated that RAW had the capability to bypass border defenses, identify critical infrastructure, and execute a strike deep within the adversary's homeland.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forced the Pakistani military to divert massive resources inward, just to secure their own logistical spine.
It proved they could reach the heat source, going back to our analogy.
Yep.
But the analysis makes it clear that this aggressive posture carries a terrifying consequence. It triggers a retaliatory feedback loop.
It absolutely does.
Mhm.
When you degrade the adversary's conventional military communication, they lean even heavier into asymmetric proxy terrorism.
Which brings us to the darkest failure analyzed in the text, the 2008 Mumbai attacks.
Yeah. Mumbai stands as the grim antithesis to the successes we've discussed.
It was a masterclass in exploiting the exact bureaucratic and structural vulnerabilities we dissected earlier.
It really was. I
Yeah.
mean, the attackers utilized the sea route, which exposed catastrophic gaps in India's coastal radar and maritime surveillance integration.
Because the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the domestic intelligence agencies were operating completely disparate databases.
They weren't talking to each other. And the domestic logistical network that supported the attackers went entirely undetected.
How did they manage that?
The terrorists utilized heavily encrypted VoIP voice-over Internet Protocol communications routed through foreign servers.
Which completely bypassed the traditional SIGINT nets RAW and the IB were monitoring.
Exactly. And they exploited a fragmented domestic identity management system using local SIM cards acquired through forged documents.
It was a systemic failure of imagination, a total collapse of interagency synthesis.
Because the intelligence actually existed, there were warnings regarding a maritime threat to coastal cities.
But the data points were trapped in competing bureaucratic silos, lacking a unified analytical mechanism to form a coherent, actionable picture.
And the trauma of the Mumbai attacks violently shattered the status quo. The political leadership demanded immediate, sweeping modernization of the entire intelligence architecture.
Right, so we see a massive influx of capital into the agencies, the establishment of centralized multi-agency threat synthesis centers.
And critically, India aggressively expands its intelligence cooperation with Western agencies like the CIA and MI6.
To gain access to advanced metadata analysis tools and global terror financing tracking mechanisms.
Exactly. And that trauma-induced modernization directly laid the operational groundwork for the post-2016 paradigm.
The era of the surgical strikes.
Yes. This represents the full crystallization of India's modernized, integrated, anticipatory defense doctrine.
Because following severe terror attacks on Indian military installations, the political leadership determined that the traditional posture of strategic restraint had exhausted its utility.
It was basically just inviting further proxy aggression.
So they launched the surgical strikes. And the operational mechanics of these strikes are a breathtaking display of multi-domain synchronization.
It's wild. You have RAW utilizing highly advanced high-altitude drone surveillance combined with deeply embedded human assets to physically map the exact perimeters, guard rotations, and structural layouts of terror launch pads.
Which are situated across the heavily militarized line of control.
Right, and this raw intelligence is then handed off seamlessly to Special Forces units.
A complete 180 from the silo issues of 2010.
Exactly. These teams infiltrate through heavily mined terrain at night, utilizing localized satellite jammers to blind Pakistani border sensors.
And low probability of intercept communication gear to coordinate the kinetic raids.
Simultaneously, you have the IB operating at maximum capacity domestically, utilizing advanced facial recognition and metadata sweeping to monitor local sleeper cells.
Just to preempt any sympathetic retaliatory attacks within India's borders while the strike is happening.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the integrated machine they failed to build before 2008.
It really is. But here is the critical strategic question that comes up when reading this.
Okay.
By stepping out of the shadows, by openly holding press conferences and officially claiming these surgical strikes on foreign soil, isn't India violating the cardinal rule of covert operations?
Which is plausible deniability.
Right. Aren't they risking a rapid, uncontrolled escalation into a full-scale conventional or nuclear war by being so public about it?
That is the defining strategic gamble of the modern era. And Whitmore explores this extensively.
What's the calculus?
By publicly claiming the strikes, India deliberately dismantled the old ceiling of deterrence. The political calculation was that Pakistan would not risk a total suicidal nuclear exchange over the destruction of non-state proxy camps.
So India proved they could pierce the nuclear umbrella, execute precise punitive kinetic violence, control the global public narrative, and extract their forces.
All without triggering a conventional war.
They completely rewrote the psychological map of the region. They proved they could impose a massive, undeniable cost for proxy terrorism.
Yes, but, and this is a big but, The analysis heavily emphasizes the razor-thin margin of error in this new
I
doctrine.
can imagine.
This hyper-aggressive posture relies entirely on absolute intelligence supremacy.
Right, because if a drone misidentifies a target,
Or if a special forces team accidentally engages a regular Pakistani military barracks instead of a militant camp.
the escalation ladder becomes uncontrollable. The new deterrence demands operational perfection.
Absolutely perfection.
And as intense as that Western theater is, if we shift our focus to the northern border and the new frontiers, the complexity multiplies exponentially.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at the eastern and northern front with China, specifically analyzing the 2020 Galwan Valley clash. This is an entirely different operational environment.
Galwan represents a stark collision between physical, archaic, hand-to-hand combat and cutting-edge 21st century statecraft.
Because it was a brutal, lethal, physical clash at extreme altitudes. But beneath the surface of that kinetic event was a profound intelligence struggle.
Right, because the Himalayas present an absolute nightmare for technical intelligence gathering.
The text details how the geography actively fights the intelligence apparatus. You cannot rely on optical satellite imagery because massive cloud cover and violent weather systems constantly obscure the high-altitude valleys.
And the extreme cold degrades electronic sensors and drastically limits the loiter time of surveillance drones.
Which means, in an era of AI and space-based surveillance, the multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus is suddenly forced to rely almost entirely on the most archaic tool in the arsenal.
Human intelligence.
Right. They are heavily dependent on cultivating networks among Tibetan refugees, nomadic herders, local villagers.
Just to track PLA troop movements and supply convoys through the mountain passes.
But the MSS, the Chinese state security apparatus, is operating an incredibly sophisticated, digitized surveillance state in Tibet.
So cultivating human assets in that environment is exceptionally lethal.
And the Chinese are executing those salami slicing tactics we mentioned.
Right, they aren't launching massive tank columns. They are slowly, methodically moving a patrol camp a few hundred yards forward.
Building a small communications tower, expanding a dirt road, it is microaggression designed to stay just beneath the threshold of a military response.
And the crucial takeaway from the Galwan intelligence autopsy was the realization that monitoring tactical border movements was insufficient.
Because Chinese strategy is holistic.
Exactly. A troop movement in the Himalayas is directly correlated to a massive infrastructure investment in a neighboring country under the Belt and Road Initiative.
Which is in turn correlated to an aggressive cyber espionage campaign targeting India's power grid.
Right, so Indian intelligence had to evolve from tracking border patrols to mapping out China's entire global geopolitical and economic stratagem.
Which naturally drives us into the absolute bleeding edge of this shadow war, the cyber battlefield and the weaponization of data.
Yeah, the analysis details India's massive, aggressive push into offensive cyber operations.
We are talking about utilizing highly advanced AI algorithms to sweep through unimaginable oceans of metadata.
The cyber domain is the ultimate frictionless force multiplier. The modern doctrine synthesizes digital espionage directly with traditional physical tradecraft.
The mechanism of that is so fascinating. Like, an offensive cyber unit successfully penetrates a foreign government server and steals an encrypted database.
Then AI algorithms parse that database, identifying behavioral patterns, financial irregularities, geolocation metadata.
And that digital harvest is then handed to a raw field operative.
Right, who uses that specific targeted leverage, perhaps evidence of an illicit affair or hidden offshore accounts, to recruit a high-level foreign diplomat.
It is a seamless loop between the server farm and the dark alley.
Yeah, and the physical biometric databases, retinal scans, facial recognition algorithms have completely shattered traditional methods of infiltration.
Because you can't simply forge a passport to slip an agent across a border when the checkpoint is linked to an AI-driven biometric identification matrix.
Exactly. But the text also exposes the severe internal friction generated by this digital revolution.
The cultural collision within the intelligence agencies.
Right. You have the old guard, the veteran operatives who have spent decades surviving on gut instinct, physical tradecraft, and human intuition.
And they are deeply skeptical of handing over operational authority to a black box algorithmic model.
Understandably so. And they are fighting against an archaic, sclerotic government procurement bureaucracy.
It is incredibly difficult to rapidly acquire and deploy agile, cutting-edge software solutions when you are bogged down by the rigid, multi-year procurement cycles of a massive state government.
They are essentially trying to outmaneuver a hyper-agile digital adversary while carrying the weight of 20th century paperwork.
Despite those profound bureaucratic hurdles, though, the reach of this apparatus is expanding globally.
Yeah, and the final frontier we need to unpack is India's global operations and the surveillance of the diaspora.
Because as India's economic power and geopolitical footprint have expanded onto the global stage, its intelligence agencies have been tasked with securing those interests worldwide.
Operating extensively across North America, the UK, and Africa.
This is where we see the concept of the geopolitical nervous system come into play. A threat is no longer constrained by physical proximity to the border.
Right, the intelligence agencies are operating under diplomatic, commercial, and academic cover in major Western capitals.
They are heavily monitoring massive, sprawling diaspora communities.
The specific operational focus within these diaspora communities is tracking the ideological and financial lifelines of separatist movements.
Because a radicalized cell operating in a quiet suburb in Canada or the UK might be funneling millions of dollars through shell companies and cryptocurrency.
To fund kinetic terror operations back in the Punjab or Kashmir valleys.
So, touching a nerve in Toronto or London, tracking a financial network, monitoring a radical cleric, or executing a clandestine disruption operation.
It's a direct reflex action required to prevent a systemic hemorrhage back in New Delhi.
It is an incredibly vast, interconnected theater, but they are not operating in a vacuum. They are actively hunting and being hunted by their primary adversaries, the ISI and the MSS, on foreign sovereign soil.
Which introduces an immense volatile layer of diplomatic risk.
Oh, absolutely.
Operating aggressive kinetic counterintelligence on the sovereign soil of allied Western nations requires a terrifying degree of subtlety.
Because if a highly classified operation is botched, or a covert asset is exposed by a host nation's domestic intelligence agency,
the resulting fallout can instantly trigger a massive diplomatic crisis, threatening billions in trade and strategic defense partnerships.
the stakes in this global theater are exponentially higher than the regional border conflicts.
Without a doubt.
So if we pull all of these threads together, from the historical trauma of 1962 that birthed the institutional divides, through the brilliant subversion of the Mukti Bahini,
The grueling attrition of Kashmir.
the terrifying calculus of the surgical strikes, the high-altitude blindness of Galwan, all the way to the algorithmic warfare and global diaspora tracking. What is the definitive mechanism driving this entire machine?
The absolute, irreducible core of Whitmore's analysis is the unending cycle of pressure, response, and subsequent escalation.
The feedback loop.
Exactly. Indian intelligence does not operate in a paradigm where a conflict can be solved.
Yeah.
They operate in a relentless, unforgiving feedback loop.
A geopolitical threat generates immense structural pressure. That pressure forces the intelligence apparatus to innovate and execute a highly complex, proactive response.
Whether it is an AI-driven cyber raid or a kinetic surgical strike.
But the execution of that strike does not end the game. It simply alters the board.
Right. The adversary absorbs the blow, studies the tactic, adapts their defenses, and launches a more sophisticated, asymmetrical retaliation.
Which in turn dials the pressure cooker up even higher, forcing India to develop an even more extreme capability.
And this leads to the most sobering conclusion in the entire analysis: the illusion of permanent advantage.
In the shadow war of South Asia, there is no final victory condition.
None. Covert operations, no matter how brilliantly conceived or flawlessly executed, cannot solve fundamental, deep-rooted geopolitical or ideological conflicts.
Their only function is to momentarily manage the equilibrium of power.
Every single technological leap, every recruited double agent, every successful disruption of a terror cell inherently carries the seed of a future, vastly more complex and vastly more lethal threat.
We are looking at a massive democratic state that is fundamentally securing its daily existence in the absolute dark.
Relying entirely on a sprawling network of analysts, hackers, and field operatives who must function with flawless precision under unimaginable continuous pressure.
Their greatest triumphs will remain permanently classified, but their slightest miscalculation could easily spark a regional nuclear conflagration.
It is a phenomenal dissection of the reality of modern statecraft. Power is not what is presented on the diplomatic stage.
Power is the quiet, ruthless capacity to anticipate and dismantle a threat before the public even realizes they were in danger.
Truly.
Which leads me to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry with you.
Okay.
As we see this doctrine of anticipatory defense, cyber warfare, and highly deniable, intelligence-driven sabotage become the primary language of survival, not just in South Asia, but increasingly on the global stage, are we witnessing the quiet death of traditional diplomacy?
Right.
If true geopolitical power, the actual leverage that decides the fate of nations, is only negotiated in the shadows through biometric algorithms, proxy militias, and precise kinetic strikes, what does that mean for the future of global democracy and the open society?
That is a dark thought.
If the pressure cooker never vents and the conflict can never be resolved, does the shadow realm eventually consume the visible state entirely?
A profound and, frankly, terrifying implication to consider.
We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next